right. Hello, everyone. My name is Piper Doherty with Seattle Arts and Lectures. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us here this evening as we honor 3 books from authors who are deeply embedded in SAL and in Seattle's greater literary community. I have the distinct honor to recognize Tiffany Midge, Donna Miscolta, and Kathleen Flenniken, whose books have been long awaited and came into this world amidst an unprecedented global pandemic. Before we begin, I also want to thank our co-presenter of tonight's event. Thank you so much to Elliott Bay Book Company for promoting and providing books from all of our authors tonight. You can find the direct link for every book both on our Facebook event and Seattle Arts and Lectures event page. It's an incredibly tough time for booksellers right now, but we know with the support of Seattle's literary community and the continuous hard work of everyone at Elliott Bay, we'll all come through this together. Kathleen's book, Post Romantic, actually officially releases tomorrow from University of Washington Press, so I highly recommend ordering all of these fabulous books ASAP. Tonight, we will hear from 3 authors who deeply play with and against assumptions of American identity. As we roll toward this most critical of elections, what better time to examine how we learn to become Americans and the marks America leaves on our psyches. After a brief reading from each writer, they will be joined by Rena Priest, who will host a conversation with our panelist readers. We invite you to stick around for an open Q&A between the audience and these 4 this evening. It's my great honor to first introduce Tiffany Midge. Tiffany Midge is a citizen of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe and was raised by wolves in the Pacific Northwest. Her most recent book is the memoir, Bury My Heart at Chuck E. Cheese's by Bison Books, which Sarah Vowell called a wry and astute charmer. Midge's McSweeney's essay, Open Letter to White Women Concerning the Handmaid's Tale and America's Historical Amnesia, won a 2019 Pushcart Prize, and her subversively comic collection of poems, Horns, is forthcoming from Spokane's Scablands Books. Midge was the 2019 Simons Public Humanities Fellow for University of Kansas Hall Center for the Humanities. She's appeared on Livewire with Luke Burbank and broadcast interviews with Tara Gatewood for Native America Calling and Rosanna Deerchild's CBC Radio 1 Without Reservation. Midge aspires to be the distinguished writer in residence for Seattle's Space Needle and considers her contribution to humanity to be her sparkly personality. Find her at tiffanymidge.wixsite.com. Everyone's giving you the grandest round of applause, Tiffany, as I will unpin myself and get you on the screen. Perfect.
Well, thank you, Piper. Hello, everybody. Tonight, I wanted to share something that is a little bit Halloween-y because I do love this season and I think it's good to celebrate this season. And it's also sort of a memoir piece that's from my book, Bury My Heart at Chuck E. Cheese's, because I thought that we were talking a little bit about experiences of childhood and how certain childhood experiences shaped us. And so this piece is called Ghoul Interrupted, and it's about the Exorcist movie. It's not terribly scary though, so you don't have to leave the room or anything like that. Ghoul Interrupted. Do we fear demons or do we fear possession? I remember scenes in The Exorcist, demon girl creeping down the staircase like a spider, demon girl's head spinning like a top, demon girl announcing death to all, then peeing on the floor, demon girl clearly out of control. Demon girl is prepubescent, premenstrual, hormonal. The patriarchy is powerless and must describe demon girl demonically possessed. But is she? What's the cultural message? The patriarchy made me do it. The social consciousness's fear of burgeoning womanhood, women on the verge, girls with urges, hormonal surges, and sex splurges. It is the whore of the whore, the female body in revolt, boy toy exploits, feminine foibles. 2, I was 8 when my altruistic and supposedly socially conscious parents took in 15-year-old foster child Jerry. It was December of 1973, and The Exorcist had just been released. Our new foster child, Jerry, boasted about having seen the movie, and one of his favorite ways to impress my sister and me was to detail particulars of especially gruesome scenes as if describing the aftermath of a car accident. He recounted the horrors blow by blow, vividly. He also laid the groundwork for monumental pranks. One of them involved rigging my mother's dresser with strings and wires to slam the bedroom door shut after she entered the room. Another involved me lying in bed, spitting pea soup and speaking some approximation of Latin or tongues. These never panned out, but he did manage getting his shit together enough to paint The Exorcist in red paint across the side of the backyard playhouse. 3, I have read feminist critiques on movies like The Exorcist, Carrie, and The Exorcism of Emily Rose, and they all seem to view the demon as a symbol for female sexuality. Demons are a girl's best friend, one article surmised. The critiques point to the terror men throughout the centuries must have felt when confronted with feminine power, which explains the Salem witch trials, which explains honor killings, which explains foot binding and corsets, not to mention infanticide, veiling, and the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders. 4, my first viewing of The Exorcist occurred sometime in high school in the basement TV room of a friend's house, and ever since I've been haunted by unbidden images of possessed Regan McNeil floating in her pea soup-stained nightgown while the priests shout, "The power of Christ compels you." For years, decades, such images have come to mind when I rise from the warmth of my bed to visit the bathroom. Flick goes the light, and the threat lessens. The demon girl scrambles back into the ether. It is this monster boogeyman that has forged itself into my neural pathways. This realization has been revelatory, actually, a breakthrough. Part of the reasons for my indelible imaginings probably have something to do, if not everything to do, with our foster child's habitual haunting of my own prepubescent burgeoning. I wasn't in danger of being possessed by demons, but having my virginity possessed by a 15-year-old sex maniac my parents deemed appropriate to live in our house. Not a day would go by when Jerry didn't pin me down and torment me, when my developing breasts weren't the topic of discussion, when roughhousing always seemed to serve as just an excuse to feel me up. I developed early for my age, and Jerry taught me that it was not a casual event, but that it should elicit special attention, a lot of special attention. 5, it was the 70s. Words like rape and pedophilia had not appeared in the national dialogue yet. I wasn't especially alerted to the idea that what Jerry was doing to me was necessarily rapey or pervy. He was just a kid, much like myself, except that he was older, a teenager. So for these reasons, I never thought to tell my parents about it. I thought it was normal. Maybe if I hadn't fought him off, put up resistance, he might have taken things further. He wasn't the first adolescent boy who put his hands on me in that way. During visits to my mom's res left behind at the house while the adults went off to do whatever it was that adults went away at night to do, my much elder cousin, like 16 or older, on the pretense of being cold and wanting to cuddle up inside my sleeping bag with me for warmth, shoved his hand down my underwear, explored whatever it was he felt necessary to explore. This felt unwelcoming and threatening, a personal invasion, and he stopped after I pushed him away. But what if he didn't stop, or if Jerry didn't stop? Maybe if sexual predation was a Judy Blume book, I would have known differently, known it was wrong. Maybe if it was an after-school special or an episode of the Brady Bunch, I would have responded differently. Told my mother, for instance. Told anyone. We were not having those kinds of conversations when I was growing up, and despite my 6th grade class introducing sex ed in the curriculum, only the basics were ever covered. I always wondered how my parents could sit in a theater for 2 hours viewing a film with a demon girl masturbating with a crucifix, but broaching the topic of sex was off the table for family hour. 6. Jerry continued living at our house for the remainder of the school year, occasionally disappearing for 2 or 3 day stretches until my father must have realized Jerry's rehabilitation was futile, that he wasn't going to turn into an Eagle Scout overnight. So we returned him to whatever puppy farm he was rescued from. It was years later when I told my father about Jerry's abuse. I've come to realize that it is the image of Regan McNeil which serves as a symbol for my lost innocence. She haunts me. But is it ever too late to have a perfect childhood? 7. What if instead of the Perfect Princesses franchise, Disney launched a campaign for the anti-princesses? Rather than fearing Regan McNeil's possession and all the other possessed girls from the oeuvre of possessed prepubescent girl films, Disney capitalized on reality for a damn second. Imagine the merchandise, the anti-princess theme park, ugly stepsister bed sheets, Reagan lunchbox replete with demon head twist-off cap thermos, Carrie white tampons and training bras for those dirty pillows, nightgowns with your favorite possessed girl printed down the front. Give me the underbelly of disenchantment, the unglittered, unpink, unspeckled. As much as I wanted to be a Disney princess, as much as I admired Cinderella and Snow White and Sleeping Beauty, a part of me was ruined for that. I never identified with the princesses, preferring instead the stepsister, the wicked queens, the Ouija board curious girl. As repellent and as frightening as they were, I must have known I wouldn't be or couldn't be the otherwise untouched, unspoiled, perfect tiara-wearing princess. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Tiffany. I repinned myself. Thanks for that. Okay, next we have Donna. Donna Miscolta's third book of fiction, Living Color, Angie Rubio Stories, about lessons a young Mexican-American girl learns in a world that favors neither her race nor gender, was published by Jaded Ibis Press in September 2020. Her story collection, Ola and Goodbye, winner of the Doris Bachwin Award for Writing by a Woman and published by Carolina Wren Press in 2016, won an Independent Publishers Award for Best Regional Fiction and an International Latino Book Award for Best Latino Focus Fiction. She's also the author of the novel When the De La Cruz Family Danced from Signal 8 Press in 2011, which poet Rick Barrett called intricate, tender, and elegantly written, a necessary novel for our times. Recent essays appear in PIF, Los Angeles Review, and the anthology Alone Together, Love, Grief, and Comfort in the Time of COVID-19. Find her at donnamiscolta.com. Big round of applause for Donna, everyone. I think you're still muted. There you go.
Okay. Thank you, Piper, and thank you, Tiffany. I love that essay. When I read it, I loved it just now when you read it. So thank you for that. I'm going to read a short excerpt from one of the stories in Angie Rubio, Living Color. It's called Current Events. 3 weeks into the 5th grade, Max Delgado said to Angie in the 4th line, "You're going into the smart class, aren't you?" Max was tall and already showing traces of facial hair through which a pimple or two erupted. It made him dangerous looking. His hair was wavy and a bit slick, his eyes hooded, his mouth mocking. He was known to get into fights after school, but when he spoke to Angie, his voice was quiet, a near mumble, and yet something like music, low and deep as a Righteous Brothers song. Angie nodded, her vocal cords suddenly out of commission. "You like Foursquare?" Max asked, looking briefly in the general direction of her face. By the time Angie nodded again, Max's eyes had drifted somewhere beyond the Foursquare game, so Angie cleared her throat and said, "Yes," a puny, strangulated sound. Max didn't ask another question, but when it was Angie's turn to take a square, he said, "Good luck." She immediately missed the ball that came her way, her hands meeting air while the ball grazed her shoulder, and she instinctively turned her face and closed her eyes. "You're out," Lizzie Schwartz yelled, just in case it wasn't obvious to the whole school. Angie left her square and went to the end of the line to wait another turn. Max, who had been behind her in line, should have taken her square, but someone else was in the game instead. Angie looked around the schoolyard, trying not to be obvious about it. She finally spotted him at the far end of the grounds, his hands in his pockets as he leaned against the chain-link fence, as if testing its give. He tilted his head back, observing the sky, and Angie wondered what he was thinking as he gazed at its limitless blue, wondered whether he pondered as she did the future and how to get there. More immediately, she wondered if he would ever speak to her again, and if he did, whether her mouth would manage to eke out something intelligible. Angie saw him shift his gaze toward the forceful game, and she quickly spun her own attention to the ball, as if it zigzagged with the most important thing in the world. In Mrs. O'Farrell's class, Angie was given a seat at the back of the room, which suited her just fine since it allowed her to see everyone else and get a clue as to how to behave in the smart class. On the other hand, she did feel a bit forgotten, since it was hard to be seen behind Perry Wheeler, a big boy whose glasses were secured to his head with an elastic band that made a deep dent in the back of his neck. Angie was both repulsed and fascinated by the sight, having to resist an urge to pull at the elastic and let it snap back into place, perhaps displacing some of the brain matter that made Perry such a scary, smart boy. Perry raised his hand a lot, always ready with the right answer, and when he spoke, Angie watched the skin on the back of his neck move with the syllables. Once a week, Mrs. O'Farrell assigned a couple of students to bring in a newspaper article to share for current events. She asked for volunteers, and Perry's big arm shot up. Though Angie didn't raise her hand, Mrs. O'Farrell spied her beneath Perry's armpit and said, "Thank you for volunteering, Perry. Angie, this is an opportunity for you to become an active member of the class." When Angie walked home with Sylvia that afternoon, they were joined by Judy Wycamp, who didn't even live in their direction. Angie asked what kind of article she should bring. "Oh, you know, something current in the news," Sylvia said. "Something important to our lives," Judy added. Like what, Angie wanted to ask, but now that she was in the smart class, she was afraid to ask questions about something she was already supposed to know. When they got to Sylvia's house, Sylvia said goodbye to Angie and headed up her driveway with Judy beside her. From the sidewalk, Angie watched the two of them disappear into the Rico house. Angie, grim with purpose, hurried to her own house next door to find a current event. Mrs. O'Farrell called on Perry Wheeler first during current events time. Perry talked about Hurricane Flora. He described the intertropical convergence zone and held up a diagram he'd made that explained how a hurricane forms. He'd sketched a large map that showed all of the affected countries in the Caribbean, plus the tip of Florida. Over 7,000 people were killed by the hurricane. Luckily, only one of them in Florida. Perry then pointed out the custom of naming storms after girls because of their stormy natures. This last point, offered as just another fact, elicited a smug hilarity from the boys. There were some snorts of annoyance from the girls, but no outright refutation from anyone. Angie wondered if anyone else seethed silently with rage. Mrs. O'Farrell thanked Perry for bringing in a current event that gave them scientific, geographic, and historical information. "Now, Angie, what have you got for us?" Angie wished she had thought to draw a map for her current events. Since she had no visual aids, she jumped right in with the lead-in she practiced at home. "My article is about Sam Cooke, the singer and songwriter of hits like Twisting the Night Away. He and his band." But Mrs. O'Farrell stopped her. "Angie, I'm sorry if the rules weren't explained to you, but we don't bring in news about celebrities. News about movie stars, singers, and athletes is not important to what we're learning in class." "But he got arrested," Angie said. "Angie, you'll get another chance or current event soon." Angie shrank at the snickering of classmates, cringed at the embarrassed looks on her behalf. She tucked the newspaper clipping inside her notebook and pressed it close on the article that told about Sam Cooke and his band being arrested for trying to check in at a whites-only motel in Shreveport, Louisiana. She hoped she would see Max Delgado at recess. If he happened to speak to her, even if it was only about Foursquare, she would tell him about Sam Cooke. Maybe her eyes would well with indignation. Maybe Max would offer a sleeve. Thanks.
Thank you, Donna. Oh, so cringy. Appreciate that excerpt from that. Okay. Next, we have Kathleen Flenniken. Kathleen Flenniken is the author of Post-Romantic Poems, University of Washington Press in 2020, and two previous poetry collections, Famous, published by University of Nebraska Press in 2006, named a notable book by the American Library Association, and Plume, also University of Washington Press in 2012, a finalist for the William Carlos Williams Award. Her poems have appeared in Poetry Northwest, Pank, the Iowa Review, Orion, and Third Coast. Her awards include fellowships from the NEA and Artist Trust, a Pushcart Prize, the Prairie Schooner Book Prize for Poetry, and a Washington State Book Award. She served as Washington State Poet Laureate from 2012 to 2014. Find her at kathleenflenniken.com. Everyone give it up for Kathleen. Here she is.
Thank you, Piper. Thank you to Seattle Arts and Lectures for hosting us tonight. It's such a strange time to launch a book and to have such a great organization, hosting us is really wonderful. And I want to thank Donna and Tiffany and Rena for being part of tonight. And thank you all for coming. I'm going to read 3 poems from my new book, Post-Romantic. And the book, as the title sort of implies, is about sort of coming to terms with love, different kinds of love. There's poems about marriage and family, and there's poems about America and the world. And I thought tonight I would just focus very directly on this idea of where we get this idea of how to be American. And that goes back to childhood. This very first poem I picked because I feel like it's in conversation with Angie Rubio, and so this poem is for Donna. It's called 1968. It used to be called Coconut, but I thought that this setting a time frame for this childhood scene gives you a sense of the background when we remember, presidential election and assassinations and the Vietnam War all going on in the background. 1968. That year we liked our ranks, our neat columns and rows of desks, or didn't know not to. We girls in plaid and sashes, we boys with pocket slingshots, turning to our reading in classrooms circumscribed by shoebox dioramas and the number line. We boys running in recess packs, we girls collecting hopscotch chains, who fogged the small paned windows on orange afternoons to write our names, then a birthday party after school, a pinwheel thumb-tacked on a pencil to take home. And rarely, maybe only once that year, someone bought a coconut to share, say a souvenir of David G's uncle's trip across an ocean, a hairy husk hammered open, woody crescents divvied up, oily milk from a Dixie cup, though we didn't like the taste, and we complained as the world began impinging on our world with its satellites, its news reports, and something in us knew it shouldn't yet, because it was enough to lie in the dark and wait for sleep. We girls decoding voices from another room, we boys alert for squealing tires and police. The next couple of poems are really quite explicitly about how we learn about patriotism. And this poem takes place inside of one of my childhood books. It was called My Prayers. And looking back at it now, I'm sort of stunned by the sort of subliminal messages about how to be American that's embedded in this book about prayer, especially this one picture that was my favorite. So that's what this poem is about. A Child's Book of America. By the time I could read its title, My Prayers, I'd already learned religion from my favorite illustration inside, a blonde girl gazing from a hilltop at her American town below. American because of the white church and wide streets, and because under the gabled roofs, the artist implied garden rakes and comfortable rooms pungent with furniture wax and clocks that chimed, and in the kitchen, butter on a dish, and in the closet, a button jar, and dozens of bright spools of thread. I resolved to be just the same, blonde, with a clock in the hall and a father who came home to dinner served in clouds of steam. I learned America as a religion, and praying feels like envy. The spirit has moved me again and again. And then this last poem takes place in my childhood bedroom, which before it was my bedroom, it was my dad's study, I guess. And he never bothered to take down the photograph of his hero, who was General George C. Marshall, until I had to ask him to. So it's called George C. Marshall, author of the Marshall Plan's Left Ear. In childhood, in the half light of my door ajar, the general's portrait on my bedroom wall glowed, and his left ear grew by borrowing light from a white stripe in the American flag behind him, transforming it into a kind of receiver or spying device that tapped my dreams. So I was afraid, but my father hesitated to take the picture down, explaining it had to do with saving Europe after the war. This is what I understood, my fear budging against my father's love for a man who merged at night with the stars and stripes. Something to do with allegiance, something to do with light and dark. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I love those poems. I had shivers. Okay, I'm going to introduce Rena, and then we'll get into our conversation here. All right, Rena Priest. Rena Priest is a poet and a member of the Lummi Nation. Her literary debut, Patriarchy Blues, was honored with the 2018 American Book Award. Her most recent collection, Sublime Subliminal, was published by Floating Bridge Press. She is the recipient of an Allied Arts Foundation 2020 Professional Poets Award and residency fellowships from Hawthornden Castle, Hedgebrook, and Mineral School. She is a National Geographic Explorer and a 2019 Jack Straw Writer. Her work can be found in For Love of Orcas, Cosmonauts Avenue, Poetry Northwest, High Country News, and Nautilus. So thank you, Rena, for moderating this evening's conversation between Tiffany, Donna, and Kathleen, and I will give you all the floor, all four of you. Here we go.
Thank you. Gosh, wow, that was really something to hear all of you read. That was amazing and stunning and so much to think about and take in, and I'm excited about our conversation this evening. So how this will go is I thought that we might start off with a question about how you're all doing and where you're at, where you're coming to us from, and what you're what's keeping you sane in these crazy times. Yeah, so let's go ahead and just, as you feel moved. I think you're muted, Kathleen.
There. I started out, and I'm well. The year started out with some some rough spots. I had a cancer diagnosis, which I got through to the other side. And so that's all good, but it's been kind of a rough ride. But what's kept me sane is family and friends, keeping in touch with them, and weekly walks with my husband. Those have been really anchoring for me. And I think, you know, reading and I don't know, it's a strange time. I've been telling people I don't feel a lot of joy, but I feel a lot of gratitude. So that's been sort of where I am.
I feel the same way. It's family that I think has kept me grounded, but also busy. I'm coming to you from Sacramento. I've been here a couple of weeks and will be here a little bit longer. At the start of the pandemic, my daughter, who had been living in Ecuador, left with her infant son because she had been offered a job here, well, in Sacramento, but that fell through. So she eventually got another job in Sacramento. So we're here, and her partner made it here a few weeks ago. So the family's reunited, which is great. And so that has sort of been our focus during these pandemic times. And the big benefit is that I've been able to spend time with my grandson. So that has been really a joy. And just that's basically it. I haven't really been able to focus on much in terms of writing or reading, although I think just the other day when 2 books arrived that I had ordered, I immediately started reading them, and I feel like I'm back on track in terms of reading again. So I'm happy about that.
For me personally, I think that just being in touch with people has kept me pretty well sane. I don't have my own family, and I've been pretty isolated here because everyone I know is in Seattle, and just leaned in to, you know, whatever it is that we're all going through, and just holding my breath basically. And you know, that adage that came from the Japanese theme park on the roller coaster, please scream inside your heart. Just trying to, like, you know, practice that, you know, Zen out kind of thing, for me personally.
I didn't want to interrupt you, but I have to say I loved what you said about, okay, what did you say? You said, oh, this is a tweet. Got out of bed today, an inspiring and triumphant Native American memoir about hope and redemption. Buy it and the sequels. I want some coffee and gonna take a shower. Critics are raving. Millions of copies sold. And that was kind of like letting everybody know this is what I'm up to, but it's just so clever. I love it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Inertia. Yeah. It's
fun. So my next question is, I wanted to hear about how these books took root. You know, what was it, a character or a setting or a little, you know, snippet of a sound or dialogue maybe? And then how did you know to follow, right? Because we write so many things, and then some of them, most of it gets left behind, but sometimes they hook us and then, you know, take us on this journey and become a book. So I wanted to hear about what that was like for these books that you're launching this evening.
Well, I'll start again. Well, it's been a long journey. Some of these poems are like 10 years old. My last book was Plume. It was all written about one subject. It was written about the Hanford nuclear site and growing up next to it. And so I was still writing other poems at that time, but they didn't fit into the scope of that project. So I kept putting those to the side, and I came up with a title fairly quickly, and I decided to call it Post-Romantic. I like the sound of that, and I thought, well, it'll be about sort of the loss of innocence and, you know, this idea of love. And I like the idea of family or marriage and country, and sort of playing those off of each other. But that was sort of an intellectual decision, and the truth is it just didn't come together for years and years and years. And I had worked two ways. The first book, I was just writing poem to poem to poem, which I really loved. I wasn't thinking about a book. And when I was doing Plume, it was all about the project. Will it fit? Will it not fit? And so that was another kind of way of working. And I thought, I just had this idea, well, that from now on, I'm just going to be thinking in terms of book projects. But it just, deciding that doesn't make it happen. And it just took me a very, very long time to find some kind of connection between those two ideas. And it wasn't really something I was able to do very decidedly. It kind of happened through a back door, and it took a long time.
Angie Rubio also was a long time in the making. I started writing these stories 10 or 15 years ago, but I wrote them as a distraction from other projects I was working on. And after I had a couple of stories, I realized that the theme I wanted to pursue was education. And so this specific traditional education that we get in K through 12, but also the lessons that we learn, not necessarily in the classroom as part of the curriculum, but as little life lessons that are not meant to be conveyed, but they are through microaggressions or even more overt examples of racism. And so once I started working on those and filling in gaps, I knew I wanted to have this sort of chronological order, but I still wanted them to be separate stories. That's how I was writing them. And so even though I call them stories, there is an inherent kind of arc to it because it takes Angie through each grade, and her awareness increases, her responses to microaggressions becomes more intentional rather than just reactive. And so, yeah, it was a long time coming, but I did feel like there was almost immediately a sort of structure and theme to it, which helped me.
I guess it's my turn. Having been raised by wolves in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of the majority of the pieces that I wrote were a column that I used to write for Indian Country Today. It's a national, or was, it's still in existence, but at the time it had a different owner and format. So I was writing columns. I was writing short form for about a year and a half. And just sort of all culminated into this sort of collection that I sort of dashed together. And there's some longer memoir pieces, which is why I call it a memoir, at the beginnings that I had been working on for a while.
So now I think let's go ahead and start talking about the identity in your works and the discussion of it. Donna, you mentioned in a recent interview, growing up American meant discarding and disengaging yourself from your past, and that being American has to mean educating yourself and your children about your heritage and your history. Will you talk a little bit more about this and how it comes through and impacts your writing?
Sure. So it starts, in the environment where we grow up, and the pressures on my parents to be American meant not speaking Spanish or Tagalog in the home, and raising monolingual children. It also meant internalizing the prejudices they encountered, and also not just internalizing them, but also transferring them and applying them to other people in the community. So if somebody if they got the message that they weren't good enough or smart enough, they just sort of applied that to everybody around them who looked like them. So I remember in the 70s, when Black and Brown power movements were mobilizing for change. And in the city where I grew up, National City, which had been, the city government was run by mostly white people. But when a couple of Mexican-American candidates were on the ballot, my mother was very resistant to supporting them because she had internalized all these messages about not being smart enough, not being good enough. And even though I disagreed with her, I also did feel that that pervasiveness of the message was still, had really affected me too. So this thinking that being brown or Black meant being less. And so I think that, yes, we have to create our own education about that, because we're not getting it in the schools. And until the schools have a curriculum where they're not just teaching about the history, about the society and the institutions that white people built for their own advantage, and ignoring the history of the people who were here first, ignoring the history of the people who were brought here under force and duress, ignoring the history of the immigrants who came and built railroads and sorted fish in canneries. Until that happens, I think we have to be responsible for that. And I don't know how much I actually did that with my own children. I think I might have, delivered some cues, but I also think that with each generation, people are more aware. They look at things with more clarity, and they're more inclined to speak up. When my younger daughter was in high school, she signed up for an African-American lit class. And when she walked in the class and saw that a white woman was teaching this, she immediately left the class and filed a complaint with the department head. So this is something that in my stories, Angie Rubio, even though she might have had the same sensibility of the wrongness of the situation, she was not equipped to take that same kind of action, because I think that she had been so willing to accommodate other people's expectations of her, and to make herself smaller, and to exist in a smaller space. And so that's one of the reasons why I was writing these stories, to process that whole thing because a lot of these incidents in Angie Rubio's life happened to me. And so I just wanted to work through that for my own self. And so I think in general, these themes, these concepts that are present in Angie Rubio are also present in my other work to some degree. It's something that I can't avoid because it's such an integral part of who I am as a person and as a writer.
Thank you. So much of that resonates and really, calls to things in my own experience. So thank you for speaking to that so just perfectly. Now, Tiffany, in section 7 of your book, you look at the appropriation of Native identity with chapter titles like Red Like Me, a list of alternative identities to try for fun and profit, You might be a pretendian, and clown costumes banned, racist Native American Halloween costumes still okay. Now, would you talk about what might be behind this impulse to falsely identify as Native, and why it's important that this issue be written about?
I think that America is, solidly built on this idea of mythology. And when we talk about mythology, you know, as it pertains to the people and families and, you know, those sorts of things, people want to be a part of that mythology and that romanticization, you know, of America and its beginnings. There's a lot of reasons. I mean, I think, first of all, I should probably tell people a little bit about what pretendianism is, or, you know, people that, what Rena is referring to is, you know, this pervasive sort of epidemic of people that want to pretend to be other ethnicities other than white. And the most famous of that in recent years was, of course, the Rachel Dolezal case. And that was an essay that I had written called Red Like Me, as if Rachel Dolezal had also claimed to be Native American. And that was a satirical piece that I had written. So there's a lot of reasons why people want to claim Native American culture and ethnicity. And one of those things has to do with, you know, colonialism, claiming another person's identity or identity theft is sort of the last bastion of colonialism, in a sense. You know, they've taken the land, they've taken the resources, and why not just, you know, co-opt our identities as well? You know, there's a lot of opportunity in that. You know, you can make a living being a professional Indian, apparently. And one of the other aspects is more sort of the psychological sense of how it alleviates, you know, the settler guilt. If you can claim to be Native American, then that guilt isn't targeted on you or your family. Just very, very quickly, those are some of the reasons and the discussions about that.
Thank you. I love the list in the you might be a pretendian. It's just great. Maybe let's see. I'm gonna read a couple. You might be a pretendian if you legally changed your name from Weisvogel to White Eagle Soaring. You might be a pretendian if you burn to a crisp 10 minutes of strong moonlight. You might be a pretendian if your star quilt was bought at Target or has Chewbacca on it. Although, you know, Chewbacca, come on. I love Chewbacca. Okay. You might be a pretendian if you think immersing yourself in a rich cultural experience means bathing in a bathtub full of yogurt. and it goes on. It's a great book. So congratulations. Mm-hmm. And so, Kathleen, in your poem, Museum of a Lost America, you give us these lines: country of short memory, glass surfaces, and fingerprints easily wiped off. Your work deals so deftly with our collective short memory and tendencies towards creating a fictionalized national identity. Will you talk about strategies you employ in addressing these hard topics and what compels you to hold them up to the light?
So the poem you quote is from Plume, and when I was writing those poems, I was thinking about the Hanford nuclear site, which is the most contaminated waste site in our hemisphere and the largest environmental cleanup in the world. And what really scared me as I was working on it, well, and it still scares me, is the idea that we do not, as a nation, have the attention span to clean it up. We don't have that kind of focused attention that will allow us to keep directing billions and billions and billions of dollars toward a site that people in Washington state have never even heard of. But you could take that same, limited attention span and, focus it on something like racism. We just don't have what it takes to solve these problems without really buckling down and focusing, which is we have this tragic flaw. We're not able to do that. And our current, technological world works against it, not with it. So I'm thinking about that. And for me, it was sort of a natural progression to go from writing about Hanford and my hometown, and then looking at the broader country and looking at America. And what I realize is I have this sort of knee-jerk relationship with my country. It's like a troubled love affair that I don't seem to have any say in. I feel these strong feelings for the country, but they're very complicated feelings. And I feel like the language of patriotism is so simplistic that we don't really have the language for talking about complexity and the way we sort of love but hate what's going on. I have nothing but respect for people who are going out there on the front lines and fighting for what they need. And I think they are growing our vocabulary. And I think that these poems I've been working on have been my small effort for myself to try to expand my way of talking about love of country so that I can express it more fully and understand it more fully. Because it's something I think about all the time, especially this year. All of us have been thinking about it, but it's a real burden, and I'm trying to find a way of describing it to myself as much as anybody.
That actually is a good segue into a question from someone in the audience that we know, Diane April. She says, I have a 5-year-old granddaughter. I wonder what you writers would tell her tonight about growing up in an uncertain world and what it is about reading and literature that can make life, if not easier, at least impart meaning to it and offer choices and provide inspiration. So, well, what to tell a 5-year-old?
I think one of the wonderful things, I always say this about poetry, but it's true of all kinds of writing, is that it allows you to put yourself in someone else's shoes. And I think the fact that we have such a much more diverse collection of writers with each passing year, with many different kinds of experiences, it is a wonderful way to appreciate what other people live that maybe I don't live, but I can see it when I'm reading those poems and feel it. So I think that's the great gift of literature. It's a great gift of poetry as far as I'm concerned. And I think that's kind of how we're going to have to get through this really difficult time in our country, is to get towards an understanding of what other people are feeling. And I think we do that through literature.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I was just going to say, I see some of that in the poem that you read, A Child's Book of America, where she's reading about what American identity is as presented in that book. And then like there's that one way that it's not really attainable for like most people, so, but that there are alternatives that are offered, and how great to be able to visualize yourself through and see yourself through these characters and some of the stories that are told. Sorry, Donna, go ahead.
No, I was just going to agree with what Kathleen said, and also the whole idea of reading works by diverse authors, and to make sure that those stories that are about diverse characters are actually written by somebody who has experienced that, so that we're not getting books by white writers who are writing about Native Americans or Latinos, that those books that we're selecting are actually written by people of color.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. Own Voices, that campaign, it's really gotten up to speed, particularly in the last couple of years, more so than ever. So I'm really grateful to that. And it's exciting, at least on my horizon, my side of things with the Native American and novels and books and literature, to see that happening, because it hasn't happened like that in the past.
Yeah, that's major. I heard that we're still not even quite at 2% in terms of representation in the children's literature market for Native Americans. And it's like, oh, wow, that's kind of, there was a graphic put out, and I think it's actually put out every year showing representation, and it's white characters and then animals and then everybody else, right? Like whoop, right on down the line. So it's good. It's getting some attention, and that we're working on it and being able to work towards expressing all types of identity, which leads me to a question for Donna about not thinking that you could write, and that writing was something that was done in the past, because it was all when you were coming up, white male authors who were long dead, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And when you came to the realization that you also like could have a voice.
Yeah, I mean, I think that growing up, we didn't have a lot of role models in terms of women doing things or women of color doing things. And even though I was a big reader, and I mean, being assigned book reports in junior high school, I ended up reading a lot of William Faulkner and Henry James, and I don't regret it, because I did feel like I got something out of those works, and but it just sort of reinforced the idea that where are the women, and can I have to say, it didn't even occur to me back when I was growing up that I could be a writer. And it wasn't until I was in my late 30s that I finally sort of acknowledged this really long suppressed desire to write. And I think I've told this story before, but Kathleen Flenniken was sort of the impetus for me signing up for writing classes, because I attended her reading in it was June 1992. And it was just sort of a revelation to me that there was somebody I knew had written a book, and she was standing in front of an audience reading it. And it was inspiring, and it was also, as I said, revelatory, and it made me think that maybe this was a possibility for me too. So, it was, I'd also had sort of switched from reading a lot of Virginia Woolf to reading more contemporary writers, Elena Maria Viramontes, Denise Chavez, Cristina Garcia. And so it just made me realize that these are stories that are out there, and that there's room, or there should be room for other stories too. So.
Yeah, I thought I had this idea that I would marry a writer. I never thought that it would be me. I just thought that it would be the man would be the writer. I think we're all sort of, we're creatures of our time, and it's hard to knock some of that out of yourself. It's very hard.
Yeah, I like, Tiffany, I found a story about how you came to writing. I thought it was just really beautiful. It was a 6th grade teacher, right? And she said, what did she say to you?
I think it must have been something in my notebook for my end of the year autograph book, where she had just written a short note saying that she had hoped to read a book by Tiffany Midge one day. because I was writing really strange things, like my school report on the state of New Hampshire. I had written my school, my boring kind of pedestrian school report about as if the state of New Hampshire had just like disappeared overnight. So I was writing about everything as in the past tense, insofar as everything about the state, the industry, and the people and the population and, all of that kind of thing. So she just was like always liking the stuff that I was turning in.
I love that. So you were already kind of well on your way, and then she just was like, yeah, look at you go.
What are you gonna do? I mean, teachers, yeah. I mean, they're our first source, to being able to hold a mirror up to ourselves. And it's great. The teachers are wonderful. I had some good ones.
Yes. So I think are there any more questions from? I want to go ahead and make a little bit of space there, just in case anyone has anything. There's just a lot of applause for you here. But if anyone had something that they wanted to ask, I wanted to be able to leave a little bit of time for that. Okay.
It's nice to get those silent little yays and hoorays. That's
Yeah.
so sweet. Thank you all so much for coming. It's great.
I think we'll call it. Do we feel good? Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Rena, for your incredible preparation. And those questions were magical. And yeah, maybe we'll just all say like goodbye to our audience, and I hope everyone has a really wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening, and to the writers for sharing all of your amazing words and stories. This is just a really special evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.